October 24th, 1942, the sun hadn't yet broken over the Egyptian desert when British Sherman crews rumbled toward German lines near El Alamein. Engines growled, treads crushed the sand, and the tank commanders braced for what every soldier knew. Once the shooting started, survival would be measured in seconds. Doctrine was iron law. Stop before you shoot. Everyone knew it. The British, the Germans, the Soviets, the Americans. A moving tank was a terrible gun platform. Its hull bounced. The guns swayed. The sight picture shook so violently that aiming beyond 200 yards was nothing more than wishful thinking. Every tank battle in every manual on Earth repeated the same truth. Fire on the move and you waste ammo. But that morning, something happened that should have been impossible. As shells whistled overhead and tracer fire cut across the sand, a handful of British Sherman tanks did the unthinkable. They kept moving. Their drivers never touched the brakes. Their gunners never waited for the hull to settle. The tanks advanced at 8 miles per hour and hit German armor with their first shots. The German Panzer crews hesitated in disbelief. They had stopped to take careful aim, exactly as they had been trained, yet they were being destroyed by tanks that weren't even standing still. It made no sense. Physics didn't allow this. No army had ever built a tank that could accurately fire while moving, but someone had just changed the rules of armored warfare, and no one on that battlefield, not the Panzer commanders, not even most of the Sherman crews, understood how. Before that strange morning in Egypt, every military on Earth agreed on one thing. Tank guns were slaves to physics. A tank charging across rough ground is never still. The hull heaves over dips and ridges. Suspension springs recoil. 40 tons of steel flexes and vibrates like a ship in a storm. Now imagine bolting a 9-foot cannon to that chaos, a gun that weighs more than a small car, and asking a human gunner to hold a target steady in his sights. The result? You can't. Decades of testing had already proven it. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, crews tried again and again to hit targets while tanks were moving. Their success rate beyond a couple hundred yards was laughable, less than 10%. At 800 yards, it dropped so low it was barely measurable. This wasn't an opinion, it was math. If a gun barrel rises just 3 degrees while the tank bounces forward, that error becomes a 40-foot miss downrange. It doesn't matter how skilled the gunner is. By the time he lines up a shot, the tank has already lurched again and the target has jumped out of view. So every armored doctrine on the planet adopted the same survival rhythm, greater than advance. Stop, fire, move. Stop long enough to aim. Fire before the enemy does. Then move again before they land a hit. It was ugly, predictable, and slow, but it was the only way to survive in a tank duel. Everyone believed it. Every army trained it. No one questioned it, until someone did. The rules sounded simple on paper. Stop to fire or die trying. But inside a tank, those few seconds of stillness were a living nightmare. Crews who fought in North Africa remembered it not as strategy, but as terror wrapped in procedure. Interviews with exhausted survivors of early battles told the same story over and over. When you spotted an enemy tank, the hardest moment wasn't pulling the trigger. It was waiting to. You see him first and you think maybe you've got the drop on him, one American sergeant recalled, still shaking as he spoke to an Army interviewer. But then you have to yell at your driver to stop. And in those 3 seconds it takes the tank to settle. You're thinking, he sees us now. He's aiming too. One of us isn't getting out of this another crewman, doing the brutal math out loud, describe the trap of tank combat. The German Panzer IV has a high-velocity 75mm gun. At 1,000 yards, it'll punch straight through our armor. If we fire while we move, we miss, so we have to stop. That takes maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds sitting still in the open while someone aims straight at us. You do that enough times, and eventually your luck runs out. Tank warfare wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic duels between steel giants. It was a race, a desperate scramble to line up a shot before the other guy did. No one knew it yet, but those lost seconds, those deadly little pauses, were the exact weakness one quiet engineer was about to remove from the battlefield forever. In 1939, while Europe was already burning, the United States was still trying to prepare for a war it knew was coming. On paper, America had a tank force. In reality, it had outdated machines, inexperienced crews, and doctrine borrowed from other nations. Against German panzer divisions that had smashed through Poland and France, U.S. armor would have been hopelessly outclassed. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department knew it. They weren't looking for an edge. They were looking for a miracle. So that spring, buried beneath procurement forms and engineering memos, a classified request quietly left Washington and landed at the Westinghouse Electric Corporation. It contained just one sentence: develop a system to keep a tank gun steady while firing on the move at speeds up to 15 miles per hour. No instructions, no diagrams, no suggestions. Just a raw demand for something every military scientist in the world had already dismissed as fantasy. The contract didn't even list a penalty for failure because failure was assumed. Naval ships used stabilized gun platforms. Aircraft had gyro-controlled instruments. But a tank was a violent, rattling, brutal machine, one that crashed over rocks, slammed through mud, and survived artillery shockwaves. Gyroscopes were delicate instruments used in calm environments. Tanks were anything but calm. Inside Westinghouse, engineers read the request and laughed. If this problem could have been solved, someone else would have done it already. But one engineer didn't laugh, and his name was Clinton H. Hanna.
Clinton Hanna wasn't a soldier. He didn't fire guns or study tactics or dream of battlefield glory. He was a 34-year-old engineer from Westinghouse, a quiet specialist in precision control systems, the kind of man who solved problems with patience instead of ego. He had spent years designing naval fire controls that helped ship guns stay level on rolling seas. He understood gyroscopes better than most men alive. He knew how to tame motion with math and machinery. And for that reason alone, the nearly impossible stabilization project landed on his desk. From the start, almost everyone expected him to fail. Officers in the Ordnance Department whispered that the assignment was political theater, a way to say America was trying something innovative without any expectation of results. Tank crews who heard rumors joked that it would be just one more system to break down in combat. Even Westinghouse colleagues doubted it. Gyroscopes belonged in laboratories and calm mechanical environments, not inside a 30-ton steel box shaking itself apart over rocks and trenches, and certainly not bolted to a 1,500-pound cannon that recoiled like a sledgehammer every time it fired. Still, Hanna got to work. His first prototype used 2 gyroscopes built with careful redundancy in case one failed, a reasonable engineering choice on paper. But in a tank, it became a monster. Heavy, slow, overcomplicated. In the summer of 1940 at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the prototype was tested on a moving tank. The best it could do was hold the gun within 3 degrees of steady aim. 3 degrees sounds precise until you calculate what that means in combat. At 800 yards, it was a 42-foot miss. Whether the shell hit dirt or sky didn't matter. It wasn't hitting a tank. The verdict from Aberdeen was brutal. Too slow, too heavy, too crude. Back to the drawing board. Most engineers would have given up. Hanna didn't. Because by then, he had learned enough about the problem to glimpse something no one else saw. The answer didn't lie in reacting to motion. It had to anticipate it. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war, and every development timeline in America caught fire. The M4 Sherman tank was scheduled to enter mass production in early 1942, and suddenly there was no time left for theories. The stabilizer had to work now, or it would be abandoned forever. Hanna threw out everything he had built and started again. The problem, he realized, wasn't that gyroscopes couldn't stabilize a gun. It was that earlier designs, his included, were always chasing motion, trying to correct it after it had already happened. Too late. Too slow. The real solution had to be predictive, so he designed something radically simple, a single high-speed gyroscope mounted to measure the gun's vertical movement. Instead of waiting for the tank's motion to throw the gun off target, the gyroscope would detect the disturbance the instant it began. and trigger a correction before the gun even moved. It didn't react to motion. It prevented it. Spinning at 10,000 revolutions per minute, the gyroscope generated angular momentum strong enough to resist changes in orientation. When the tank traveled over uneven ground and the hull tilted, the gyroscope sensed the shift and instantly sent an electrical signal to a hydraulic servo. The servo pushed the gun in the opposite direction. Equal force, opposite reaction, holding it steady in defiance of terrain. And the beauty wasn't just in what it did, it was in how easily it fit into the Sherman. It weighed under 300 pounds. It used the tank's existing turret hydraulics. It required no separate power system. It sat quietly between the gunner's hand controls and the main gun. To the crew, it looked like a black metal box with 2 switches, nothing more. In September 1941, at Aberdeen, Hanna rolled out his second prototype Sherman, this time with the new single gyro system installed. The test officer gave the order. Target at 800 yards, firing on the move. Begin with the stabilizer switched off. 10 shots fired, only 1 hit. With stabilizer switched on. 10 shots fired. 7 hits while moving over rough ground. It didn't just work. It shattered everything the Army thought it knew about tank accuracy. The order came down immediately. Approve for production. Hanna had done the impossible, or so he thought. By August 1942, the first Sherman tanks equipped with Hanna's stabilizer rolled off ships in North Africa. Every single one of them carried the black control box that made accurate fire on the move possible. And almost every crew turned it off. The reason wasn't stupidity or stubbornness. It was survival instinct. Tank crews were young, often barely trained, and overwhelmed with responsibilities. They had to learn how to drive a 30-ton machine, load and fire ammunition, use radios, navigate terrain, repair breakdowns in the field, all under combat conditions. Then someone handed them a 47-page technical manual for a strange electrical hydraulic device under the gunner's seat and said, "This helps you shoot while moving." To them, it looked like a liability, another complicated system that could jam, break, or behave unpredictably in the middle of a firefight. The setup alone was intimidating. Oil pressure had to be perfectly calibrated. The gyroscope had to spin up to full speed. Electrical connections had to be checked in precise order. Air bubbles in hydraulic lines could cause dangerous malfunctions. Tiny calibration errors meant the gun would actually fight the gunner. There was no time for crews to learn it properly. Most had never been trained on it at all, just given a brief familiarization talk by someone who barely understood it himself. So they flipped the switch to off. Too risky, too complicated. What if it locks the gun when we need it? We're not touching it. Tank commanders weren't going to gamble their lives on a system they didn't trust. The stabilizer wasn't removed. That would require depot-level maintenance. It simply became dead weight inside most Shermans, ignored, unused. The miracle had arrived at war and died on arrival. Or at least, that's what should have happened. But somewhere in that chaos, a few men decided not to ignore it. They would change everything. While American crews arriving in North Africa were ignoring the stabilizer, the British did something unexpected. They asked questions about it. Before the Second Battle of El Alamein, the British 8th Army received 252 new M4 Shermans from the United States. Westinghouse, anticipating trouble, had quietly embedded a handful of technical representatives with British maintenance units. Their job was simple: teach anyone willing to listen how to use the stabilizer. Most crews glanced at the device and dismissed it. A few tried it once and swore it was dangerous. But a small number, curious, stubborn, mechanically minded, stayed after drills, asked for help, and practiced. They memorized the calibration steps. They learned how to feel when the gun was fighting terrain. They trusted the black box. On October 24, 1942, as the British 9th Armored Brigade advanced into a storm of German fire, those few crews did something no tankers had ever done before. They kept moving and kept hitting. At 800 yards, at 600 yards, at 500 yards. Not every shot struck home, but enough did. German panzer crews froze in disbelief. Their opponents weren't stopping to aim. They weren't exposing themselves in the open. They weren't following doctrine. They were firing with deadly rhythm while still advancing. A captured Panzer IV gunner later told British interrogators, "We stopped to fire as always. The Americans did not. Their gun was already on us before we had even aimed. For the first time in history, tanks had won a duel without halting. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was engineering. The stabilizer worked. The battlefield had just changed. Almost nobody realized it yet. 2 months after El Alamein, American forces entered their first major armored battle against the Germans at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. It was a disaster. The U.S. First Armored Division fought hard, but German panzer units outmaneuvered and outranged them. Over 4 brutal days, 183 American tanks were destroyed. The after-action reports blamed everything from poor terrain use to bad coordination. But buried beneath the tactical failures was something no one noticed at the time. The Americans had a weapon they never used. Almost every Sherman in the battle carried Hanna's gyroscopic stabilizer, and in almost every Sherman it was turned off. Tank commanders believed they were being practical, unreliable in sand. Gun jumps around when it's on. Throws off your aim. Too risky in combat, and who could blame them? No one had trained them. No one had shown them what it could really do. The stabilizer had been shipped to war without instruction, like giving a man a rifle but no trigger. So while German crews worked through their familiar stop-aim-fire cycle, American crews did the same, even though they didn't have to anymore. The U.S. had unknowingly brought a game-changing fire control system to its first major tank battle and left it unused. A German officer wrote in his report, "Enemy Shermans stop to fire as expected. Standard engagement methods remain effective." He was right. The Americans were fighting by old rules.
But not everyone in the U.S. Army was blind to what had happened. A few sharp officers began asking a dangerous question. If the British figured out how to fire while moving, why can't we? And one young lieutenant was already working on the answer. Lieutenant Joseph McCoy didn't look like a revolutionary. He wasn't a famous commander or a decorated hero. He was just a young platoon leader in the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, a quiet, methodical officer who took machines seriously. During the voyage to Sicily in the summer of 1943, most tank crews killed time with cards, cigarettes, and letters from home. McCoy sat alone in the hold of his Sherman tank, reading a 47-page technical manual. Not once, not twice, over and over, until he could recite it. He wasn't reading about the engine or turret electrics. He was studying the one system almost everyone else ignored, Hanna's gun stabilizer. While other crews called it useless, McCoy smelled an advantage. He didn't just skim the manual, he mastered it. He memorized all 27 steps of calibration. Oil pressure, 180 to 220 psi, check. Gyro spin-up, wait for full speed, check. Electrical relay connections, check. Zero balance on elevation servo, verify. Stabilizer clutch, engaged, confirm. He and his crew practiced setup over and over until they could perform it blindfolded in 10 minutes. They didn't just turn it on, they understood it. Other officers laughed. That thing? It'll jam your gun. You'll throw it overboard after it fails once. It's a gimmick, Joe. Waste of time, McCoy ignored them. He had a theory, simple, brutal, and brilliant. If we can fire first, we can win every fight. On July 10, 1943, his theory got its trial by fire. The U.S. landed at Gila, Sicily. German Panzer IVs counterattacked the beachhead. Shermans from McCoy's platoon charged forward, stabilizers engaged. They didn't fire while moving for long-range accuracy. They fired while moving to force the enemy to flinch, to disrupt their aim, to seize momentum. By the time the American tanks came to a stop and lined up their killing shots, their guns were already on target, no aiming delay. The Germans were still centering their sights when McCoy's gunner was already yelling, "On the way!" German tanks burned. Word spread. The mockery stopped. Crews started asking questions. A change had begun. McCoy wasn't alone for long. Word of his success in Sicily moved quickly up the chain of command. Officers wanted to know, was it luck, or had the U.S. been sitting on a battlefield advantage without realizing it? To find out, the Army began formal testing at Fort Knox in the summer of 1943. This time, the stabilizer wasn't being demonstrated by engineers or factory reps.
It was being tested by combat crews who had learned how to use it under fire. The results were undeniable. Under controlled field conditions, time to first accurate shot. Non-stabilized Sherman 7 to 8 seconds. Stabilized Sherman approximately 3.5 seconds. Hit rate at 800 yards. Non-stabilized Sherman 30 to 40%. Stabilized Sherman 55 to 60%. Time required to reacquire target after moving. Non-stabilized Sherman 3 to 4 seconds. Stabilized Sherman instant. The stabilizer didn't just improve accuracy, it rewrote the timeline of a gunfight. Ordnance officers who had once dismissed the system were now forced to confront reality. Tank crews with stabilizers fired faster, hit faster, and survived longer. The official report from Fort Knox concluded, proper stabilizer use provides a decisive advantage in tank engagements. But there was still a problem. The stabilizer worked, but crews didn't trust it, and training manuals still treated it like an optional accessory. So the Army updated the doctrine. The next edition of Field Manual 17-12, Tank Gunnery, included revised instructions on how to use the stabilizer in combat. But paper doesn't win wars, soldiers do. And most of them were still overseas, still fighting, still turning it off. Winning hearts and minds would take time. But by late 1943, one truth had finally reached American tank crews. The stabilizer wasn't a gimmick, it was an edge. When American tanks landed in France after D-Day, they entered a new kind of hell. The hedgerow country of Normandy, locals called it the bocage, was nothing like the wide deserts of North Africa or the open fields of Sicily. This was claustrophobic terrain, a maze of sunken lanes and small fields enclosed by thick earthen walls and tangled roots. Visibility often dropped to less than 50 yards. Tank combat here wasn't long-range dueling, it was ambush warfare. German anti-tank guns and Panthers waited behind hedgerows like wolves behind brush. They didn't need range, they just needed the first shot. For Sherman crews, survival came down to who got their gun on target faster. This was where the stabilizer revealed its true value, not as a long-range accuracy tool, but as something even more important, a time machine. When a Sherman came under fire and needed to reverse out of danger, the violent rocking from backing up usually made aiming impossible. Without a stabilizer, the gunner had to wait until the tank came to a full stop, 3 deadly seconds, before taking a shot. But with the stabilizer engaged, the gun stayed level through the retreat. The crosshairs stayed on target. The gunner could fire while reversing at speed. Crews said it simply, "We back up shooting." German tankers later reported frustration. American tanks seemed to fire without pausing, as if they didn't care about terrain or motion, as if they were faster than physics. In a way, they were. The stabilizer didn't make Shermans stronger or thicker armored. It didn't turn the 75mm gun into a Tiger killer. But it did something far more important in Normandy. It gave American crews a fighting chance in close combat. It cut thinking time, aiming time, dying time. In the bocage, seconds decided everything, and the stabilizer gave those seconds back. The stabilizer was a breakthrough, but it wasn't working alone. What made American tanks deadly wasn't just one invention. It was a combination of systems designed to work together. The Sherman had something most people overlook, speed of control. Where German tanks relied on heavy armor and big guns, the Sherman focused on response time, how fast it could aim, move, and fire. And in a real battle, response time beats raw power, fire control speed, the real advantage. The M4 Sherman could rotate its turret 360 degrees in about 15 seconds using a powered traverse system. The German Panther, Panzer IV, could rotate 360 degrees in about 18 seconds when the power system was working, but if it failed, the crew had to turn the turret manually by hand crank, which was extremely slow. The Tiger I tank could take up to 60 seconds to rotate its turret fully when the engine was running at low speed, because its turret traverse depended on engine RPM. The Sherman also had a gun stabilizer, while neither the Panther nor the Tiger had any gun stabilization system. The Sherman could swing its turret fast and precisely, keeping targets in sight even while moving. German tanks couldn't match that. Panthers lost powered traverse often due to damage or electrical failure. When that happened, the crew had to hand crank the turret at 0.36 degrees per turn. That meant 720 full cranks to spin around once. Tiger crews had to rev their engines to turn the turret quickly. If the engine was idling, the turret crawled like a frozen door hinge. Now add the stabilizer on top of that. Sherman gunners didn't just traverse faster, they stayed aimed during movement. A Panther or Tiger might have better armor, but if it had to stop to fire and spent 4 to 5 seconds stabilizing the sight picture, a Sherman crew could hit it before its gun even finished turning. A German prisoner summed up the frustration in one interview. When we stopped to fire, the American tank was already shooting. The reason wasn't mystery, it was mechanical superiority in time. By late 1944, the stabilizer was no longer a mystery. It was a weapon system, one the U.S. Army finally understood and committed to. Sherman production was at full power now, over 1,200 tanks a month rolling out of American factories. Nearly every one of them came with the Westinghouse stabilizer installed as standard equipment. But hardware alone doesn't win battles. Training does. In 1942, only a handful of crews even knew what the stabilizer did. In 1943, maybe 15% could use it correctly. But by the fall of 1944, that number had grown to over 60%. The change was simple. Combat veterans started teaching it. At Fort Knox, training courses were rewritten. Instructors were no longer factory reps. They were tank commanders who had survived Sicily, Normandy, and the hedgerows. Men who had seen stabilizers turn 3-second losses into first-shot kills. They taught the system not like engineers. They taught it like a survival tool. You don't need to be a genius, one instructor told new crews. Turn it on. Let it work. Keep your gun on target. Fire first. Field mechanics improved maintenance routines. Setup time dropped from 12 hours in 1942 to 4 hours by late 1944. The system became simpler, tougher, and faster to calibrate. And now that crews trusted it, the numbers began to speak. Stabilizer-trained crews achieved hit rates over 70% at combat ranges between 300 and 1,000 yards. Tanks, using the stabilizer, fired 3 to 4 seconds faster. Platoons that mastered it survived longer and killed more. What once seemed impossible was now standard practice. Hanna's invention wasn't a theory anymore. It was battlefield reality. By the end of 1944, American tank crews had mastered the stabilizer. They moved faster, aimed faster, and fired faster than their German opponents. But speed alone couldn't bend physics. And physics was brutal. Because even if a Sherman got the first shot off, even if it hit, it didn't always matter. Against standard German Panzer IVs, the Sherman's 75mm gun was lethal. But against Germany's newer heavy tanks, the Panther and Tiger, Sherman's learned a painful lesson. First shot advantage means nothing if your shells bounce. The Panther's sloped frontal armor was 120mm thick, effectively more due to angling. The Tiger's front plate was 185mm of nearly impenetrable steel. At most combat ranges, Sherman crews aiming at the front armor were doing little more than announcing their position. A combat report from the Ardennes said it plainly. Direct hit, no damage. Rounds skipped off like a stone on water. Sherman crews adapted fast. Don't fight Panthers from the front. Aim for the sides, the rear, the turret ring, or the tracks. Use speed, use numbers, flank, move, stay alive. In some units, the standard order became button him, then kill him, meaning use the stabilizer to score fast hits that force the enemy to close their hatches, blocking their view, then maneuver to strike a weak spot. The stabilizer still mattered, even when it couldn't penetrate armor. It froze enemy gunners inside their tanks. It kept German optics blind. It bought time to flank. It created openings where none existed. And in the chaos of real combat, time was blood. It wasn't invincibility. It was survivability. By 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over, and the battlefield had delivered its final judgment on Hanna's invention. The debates were done. Theories were irrelevant. Only results mattered, and the results were undeniable. Sherman tanks produced 49,324. Shermans with stabilizers approximately 47,000. Crews trained to use it, by 1945, approximately 60%, up from 15% in 1943. Time to first aimed shot in combat 2 to 2.5 seconds faster. Average tank engagement length 12 to 30 seconds. Advantage in aimed shots plus 1 to 2 extra shots per battle. That last number was everything. In a 20-second duel, a tank that fires one more accurate round than the enemy doesn't just improve its odds, it survives. In fight after fight, across France, Belgium, and into Germany, one pattern appeared again and again. The crew that fired first usually walked away. The stabilizer didn't win battles alone. It didn't destroy armor by itself. What it did was far more important. It shifted probability. It tilted duels. It made survival measurable. It took something as chaotic as tank warfare, noise, mud, fear, steel, and gave one side a timing advantage that could be counted in heartbeats. And that was enough. When the war ended, medals were pinned on generals, statues were cast for commanders, and history books celebrated dramatic battlefield victories. Clinton H. Hanna didn't get a parade. He didn't become famous. Most tank crews who survived because of his invention never even knew his name. In April 1945, as Germany collapsed, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department sent him a letter. No ceremony, no flourish, just a typewritten acknowledgement. The gyroscopic stabilizer has proven invaluable in combat operations. Crew acceptance and effectiveness have increased with training. Recommend continued development for post-war armored programs. That was it. No signature, no dramatic tribute. Just a quiet nod from a bureaucracy that had once doubted him. But Hanna didn't build the stabilizer for recognition. He built it because the math said it could be done, and because soldiers' lives depended on it. He solved a problem the entire world had accepted as impossible, not by luck, not by a miracle, but by furious persistence, precision engineering, and absolute refusal to quit. And in the end, German tank crews, the fiercest armored fighters of the war, gave him the only tribute he ever needed. After the war, German panzer officers were interviewed by Allied intelligence teams. Again and again, they were asked the same question. When did you realize you were losing tank duels to the Americans? Their answers were always the same. Not when the Allies landed more troops. Not when they built more tanks. Not even when air superiority tipped the war. When your tanks began firing before they stopped moving. They didn't understand how it worked. When they examined captured Shermans, they found a strange gyroscope bolted beneath the gunner's seat, but they couldn't replicate it. They saw the parts, but not the system. They never grasped how it worked because they never saw it alive, calibrated, synced, trusted by a trained crew. They thought the advantage was in a device. They were wrong. The advantage was in the idea, the belief that the impossible was only a problem not yet solved. Clinton Hanna never wore a uniform in combat, but he changed armored warfare as surely as any general. His invention didn't roar like an engine or fire a shell. It didn't make headlines or wave flags. It sat in silence, doing its job, saving lives. War is won in many ways, by courage, by numbers, by sacrifice. But sometimes, it's won by a quiet engineer who refuses to accept the limits of physics.